Thanks for joining us on The World Now. This is TVC News. We begin with the remembrance of the saddest day in U.S. history when the deadliest attack was launched by the Al-Qaeda terror group, that's 22 years ago, on U.S. soil. Nearly 3,000 people were killed after 4 planes were hijacked by the attackers, with 2 flying into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, 1 plane into the Pentagon, and another into an open field in Pennsylvania. Let's take you back into history with our next report.
Studio, you on with me? This is Chopper 5. Studio, you copy?
It's been 2 decades since terrorist group Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center in 2001. The pictures of that event are still fresh in the memories of many affected. 22 years after, the remains of 1,104 victims have not been found, leaving a gap in the lives of their loved ones. Tuesday, the 11th of September 2001, began like every normal day in the bustling city of New York. But it ended as one in which the United States suffered its worst ever terrorist attack, leaving almost 3,000 people dead. Oh, shit! At 8:46 a.m., an American Airlines plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. On board were 76 passengers and 11 crew members, all of whom died instantly. As this news filtered the airwaves, with many still confused on what happened, at 9:03 a.m., a second plane crashed into the South Tower. At this point, it was clear that this was no accident. It was now obvious that the once safest country in the world has been attacked by terrorists who had hijacked plane and were now using them as missiles. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower collapsed. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower caved in as well. As the towers fell, an enormous cloud of dust and ash flooded the surrounding streets, chasing pedestrians as they fled. Debris from the North Tower also fell onto the nearby 7 World Trade Center building, causing it to catch fire and eventually collapse. In total, 2,753 people died in the New York City attacks. The effort took until the 30th of May 2002, when the last piece of steel was removed. There were domestic long-term effects of the 9/11 as well. Thousands of people struggle with cancer and lasting chronic health problems relating to the toxicity from Ground Zero, the site where the Twin Towers used to stand.
You guys going in?
Yeah.
The September 11 attacks also changed American air travel as airlines began to require stringent security checks designed to prevent the types of weapons the hijackers used from slipping through. The 9/11 Memorial, a museum opened on the site of the former World Trade Center on the 11th of September 2011 and features reflecting pools in the footprints of where the Twin Towers once stood. The tragedy of September 11, 2001 will never be forgotten, and the aftermath continues to unfold.
And joining me now from Washington, D.C. via Zoom to discuss this day in history and the effects it has had on world security are 2 gentlemen, a retired United States Army General, William Ward, and a distinguished diplomat in residence, School of International Service, American University, L. Wayne. Good to have you join us.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Mr. Wayne. 22 years after, how well has the U.S. fared in its resolve not to be defined by this tragedy, but by its values?
Well, I think the United States has gone through a number of phases of what we call the war on terror.
There has not been another sizable attack on the United States. There has been a whole network of cooperation established around the world. There have also been, however, a number of missteps in this war on terror that did cause thousands of lives overseas. In fact, tens of thousands in some countries, because we did have major wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan and other armed conflicts in other parts of the Middle East and currently in the Sahel in Africa. So the effects of this event have been amazingly broad and deep. I think in the United States, we are a bit safer, but that threat of terrorism, of course, continues.
And to General Ward, when you speak with Americans, what is the threat perception in the U.S. today?
Well, there are two things that I think that are important to highlight. As Professor Wayne indicated, the cooperation that exists around the world to counter the threat of terrorism has certainly increased. And here in America, as we look at what's been done to ameliorate those conditions that led to the attacks, it is important that we realize that the war on terror has many components. Identifying and neutralizing terrorists is one piece of it, but also trying to do the very best we can to make populations that are vulnerable to the influence of those terrorists less vulnerable is another aspect of it. And so as we look at what's happened here in America, the things that were done in the immediate aftermath of the attacks are well known. The increased security measures at airports, the increased requirements for checking the identity of individuals. Obviously, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, I was in the Pentagon on that morning and didn't leave the Pentagon for 5 days, given the job that I had. But in addition to the airspace issues, grounding aircraft to hopefully prevent another incident such as happened twice in New York at the Twin Towers, once at the Pentagon with the attack there, as well as the crash of the airplane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that field, to preclude that from happening again, but also understanding what might be happening to other vulnerable installations and facilities in this country. And so America, the citizens of America understand that. And the fact that it hasn't happened here in this country is certainly much appreciated, and we're thankful for that. And then as we continue to do things, ensuring that we can also address those conditions abroad that prevent those activities from even having an ability to get started remains activities and the focus of work that needs to continue to occur.
And I'm staying with you, General Ward, and I know that you have said as much as El Wayne has also said, that look, since the wake of 9/11 attack, we've seen global cooperation in terms of fighting terrorism around the world. But the very factors that serve as the precondition for terrorism at a time where issues around, people will say, religion, and then the hate, as it were, for liberal democracy. Are those factors still existent today? And what is the greatest threat to the West today?
The threat today is the inability, the reluctance, the increased work that needs to be done to cause populations in disadvantaged locations to be able to, for themselves, push away and not be susceptible to the influence of the terrorists. These groups take advantage of anything, and in the name of whatever their cause may be, they will, not I use the term, they will hijack populations to promote their nefarious purposes and causes. And so the threat to vulnerable populations is more than just taking the threat away, the immediate threat, but also helping to instill conditions that make them less vulnerable. And so as we look at what's going on around the world, be it governments and locations, the countries where things have continued to happen, the wars, if those governments and those who support those governments aren't able to cause the populations to be less vulnerable, then we continue to go through the events that we see facing any of us when the wars occur. And so the challenge is to continue to work as diligently as we can in the affected locations, and not that it's the United States or any particular country. It's certainly the responsibility is for the nation where the threat exists, but also those governments. And so it's not a factor of a particular government type or not. When governments work to support their people, wherever that may be, then the threat is mitigated to a degree. And then when it's done so that the conditions, the social conditions are improved, then those populations become less vulnerable to the threat.
And let me go to Elwayne. The U.S. used to be so worried about external threats. Today, we understand that domestic threats are just a big of a concern to the U.S. as external threats. When you look at the fact that the number of investigations by the FBI into domestic terrorism and extremism has more than doubled since 2020, how did the U.S. move from dealing with external threats to the place where terror threats have now taken a domestic turn?
Well, I think it's important to note that, as the general was saying, there's a set of tactical responses to terrorism and a strategic response, and we have to do both of them. And the tactical steps are all that we've taken at the airports, at limiting the financing of terrorism, which is something I worked on for a long time, at helping countries use their resources better to address some of these. But the strategic is really to address whatever it is that is luring these people to become radicalized and want to use violence. And the United States is not immune to that, as we've seen. In this world where we can communicate so rapidly, as we're both talking to you from the United States, bad guys and gals can communicate also. And so that touches the United States. And what that means is the United States also has to work very hard to be responsive to the fears, the needs, the worries of its population. So those who might be tempted to use violence can be educated and drawn away from that at the same time that we take all the tactical steps that are needed by the FBI and others to track and arrest those who are using violent methods. So it's very complicated. And as we've seen around the world, we've seen this sometimes in what's called democratic backsliding in democracies. We've seen people questioning democracies. This is a worldwide challenge, and it's going to continue. And we have to keep working at being smarter at this and working with other governments around the world also to address this ongoing challenge.
And to General Ward, we saw just last week, the leader of the Proud Boys was sentenced to jail for his role in the January the 6th insurrection. Some fear that, a punitive action may embolden certain far-right groups. How do you suggest that the U.S. begin to deal with domestic terrorism?
Well, for me, those acts, I took an oath to the Constitution of the United States to protect it, to defend our citizens and this Constitution. And any acts that are done counter to that, in my mind's eye, are acts that are not justified or not allowable, and steps should be taken to prevent. And those who do take those steps should be punished to the full extent that the law will allow. And that's done in our systems of courts. And so I'm happy to see that those who have done those acts are held accountable and then are taken to court and judged accordingly based on the actions that were taken. I clearly felt as if that was something that I hated to see in this country, but as Professor Wayne pointed out, none of us is impervious to those things happening. So we must remain vigilant and aware and do the very best we can do to prevent something like that from happening again.
And finally, for Elwayne, I know you've touched on global cooperation on fighting terrorism, but is the world doing enough, especially in terms of intelligence sharing?
No, I don't think it's doing enough. It's doing a lot more than it was doing on 9/11, and it's especially among trusting partners. There's a tremendous amount of intelligence sharing. But what we've seen is that the terrorist threat has evolved and it's moved to different places. And sadly, as you very much know, focus right now is in the Sahel in Africa. And there have been more terrorist events in your part of the world in recent years than we saw earlier when the focus was Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East. So this kind of reverting to violence to achieve ideological ends is happening everywhere, and it evolves and focuses. So we all in different countries have to get better at that, and we have to find ways to have more trusting relationships and more effective relationships, so we're effective both on the tactical side of going after the bad guys and, as the general said earlier, on the strategic side of addressing why people are willing to do this. So that's still a task in front of us.
Thank you both for talking to us. We'll allow you get back to the memorial. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with a retired United States Army General William Ward and a distinguished diplomat in residence, School of International Service, American University, El Wayne. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.